Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. Very happy to welcome to the event space, Mr. Rob Sylvan. Rob, how's it going today?
It's going really well. Thanks for having me back. It's been a pleasure being part of this in the past, and nice to build on that.
Definitely a pleasure to have you back. And, just a reminder, like we were talking about in the green room, as long as you don't talk about New Jersey bagels being
Come back to
keep inviting you back. So thank you to everybody who's joining us here. For those of you who may not know what we're talking about today, we're talking about some Lightroom stuff. So a little bit of an introduction to masking in Lightroom Classic, as well as Lightroom and Camera Raw as well. Want to give a thanks to our sponsors for the event, Adobe. So thank you very much to them. For anybody who has any questions for Rob, please feel free to get them in. If you're joining us here on Zoom, use the Q&A tab. If you're joining us on video or Facebook, you can use the comment section. But otherwise, I'm going to turn over the tables to Rob. Thanks for being here again, and we'll see you back in a little while.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight. Appreciate your time and attention. So let me share my screen and we will get going. All right, so hopefully you see my screen here in Lightroom Classic. I will just mention that if you're burning to learn more, I write for Lightroom Killer Tips each week, and I have a bunch of posts on here about masking. If you just come on down to somewhere, hey, there's a search field, and put in masking, you will find all kinds of tutorials that I've written. And Scott, he's a good guy. Scott's written too. So check that out. Also, a book of mine just came out, Lightroom Classic for Dummies Part 2. I just fresh out of the printer practically. So that's in all the places you can buy bookstores, Lightroom Classic for Dummies. Even if you're not a dummy, hopefully it's still useful to you. All right, so masking 2.0, as it's sometimes referred to, came out a little while ago now. The last big update for both Lightroom Classic, for the Lightroom Cloud app. So this is Lightroom on a desktop, as it's often referred to. It's here on my Mac. I'm on a Mac desktop. This version of Lightroom is also available on your iOS or Android devices. It's available on Mac and Windows. It's even available on Chromebooks. And so masking is also inside of this app. And in a bit, I'll show you where it is inside of the Camera plugin for Photoshop too. So the same set of tools, basically the same interface, slightly different because the programs are a little bit different, but the functionality that we'll cover exists across these three main photo editing applications from Adobe. So we're going to start simple. This is the introduction to it. Part 2, we're going to dive a little deeper into some of the more advanced aspects of masking, but hopefully we'll whet your appetite for those. So if you've never seen, or you've been kind of playing around with it a little bit, hopefully you'll pick up some good tips and you'll have a good foundation for building further. So here in Lightroom Classic, let's just take a look at our first photo here. Very simple. So the basic edits of all the photos I'm going to show you are done, meaning everything kind of on these panels I've tried to kind of do already. And so I always think of Lightroom Classic, Lightroom, even Camera Raw. They're intended to be for a raw workflow. It's not to say it won't work on JPEG files. In this case, I actually have a TIFF file here, or PSD, or even a PNG. But it's really, the most power is going to come from starting with a raw photo. You do all your basic edits, you apply a profile, lens corrections, all that kind of stuff. And then you might say, okay, I've done all the global edits. I've affected the overall look of the photo. But now I want to either fine tune a few pieces, do a slight selective edit in a certain area of the photo, or a certain color, or a certain tonal value. And that's where masking comes in to help you kind of finish the job. So you can apply the masking, in this case on a TIFF file, a raw file, PSD, whatever Lightroom Classic or Lightroom or Camera Raw will support. The masking functions will also work on it. And when it first came out, people were a little disoriented. So if you see that little blue circle around my cursor, that's nothing to do with Lightroom. That's just so you can see where my cursor is a little bit better. Hopefully that doesn't throw you off. But sometimes that dark cursor on this dark interface, it's hard to track. So this icon here, when it first came out, everyone thought, wait, where did my brush and my linear adjustment and my radial adjustment, where did those go? Well, they all just got a new home and a new interface because some new functionality came along. So let me just delete this mask out so we can see this panel here. So when you first come in and enable masking to a photo that has no mask on it whatsoever, you'll see the option to choose a new mask. Now, these three right here, we've had really for a long time, many years. This used to be called the adjustment brush. Now it's just the brush. We got more familiar with it. Linear gradient and radial gradient. This used to be called the graduated filter. So the naming, I think, is just to be more consistent across all of these Adobe apps that I talked about. When Lightroom for the cloud came out, it was called the linear gradient, radial gradient. So I think everything's just kind of getting a little more streamlined. Functionality is still the same as it used to be. Within these three, we used to have the ability to apply a color range or a luminance range mask to further refine that mask. We can still do that, but now we actually can apply a color range or a luminance range mask all on its own without applying a linear gradient or radial gradient or a brush first, which is pretty cool. It's its own thing. Depth range, I'll show you an example of that, but this is only going to be enabled. You can see it's grayed out right now. If you have a photo selected that was captured, typically, as far as I know, at this point in time, on an iPhone that supports that kind of portrait effect, that depth map, and it uses that depth map to make the mask. If a photo doesn't come from that origin, that's going to be grayed out. But I'll show you what it looks like if you want to have a sense of that. So let's look at a really simple example just to get familiar with the overall interface of masking. So first we open up the masking panel, and let's just try a good old-fashioned linear gradient. This is bread and butter type of an adjustment. And so we have this window light here. It's a little bit brighter than the rest of the scene. So if I wanted to just darken this down in a nice graduated way, that's what linear gradient's #1 job is. So I'm going to click right about here, and I'm going to hold the shift key, and that's going to constrain it to a perfect vertical line. If I was coming in a downward motion, all right, I could also hold that shift key and constrain it to a perfect horizontal line. Whichever way you want to go, holding the shift key allows you to constrain it. If you want it to be maybe follow the line of the window here and to be on somewhat of an angle, we can also draw it out that way. Now, you don't have to get it perfect because all of these adjustments are very customizable and certainly undoable and editable. So you just want to maybe get it in the ballpark. And so I drew this line out, and we can see here a red overlay appears. Now, by default, that overlay is going to show you where your mask is when you first apply a mask. As soon as I were to make an adjustment, let's say I want to take the highlights down, as soon as I click on that slider, that overlay goes away, right? And that way you can start by seeing where it's being applied to help you line things up. And then when you go to make an adjustment, it goes away. I think that's pretty cool. I find that to be really useful. And let's just darken it down a little more. So what's the graduated part? If I put my cursor over this pin, we can see that to the left of the line there, it's a darker red, and that's getting the full amount of whatever combination of adjustments I were to dial in. And there's a whole lot of sliders here. So I can put in any combination of these sliders, and this from this pin over to here and beyond, if I move this over, is getting the full amount of whatever that adjustment is. The graduated part is the area between this line and this line right here. That's the slow gradual part. You can kind of see that fade there. So if we wanted to make that fade go a little wider, I can just drag this line out. And now it gets even more gradual, a better fade of a feather, if you think of it that way. And we can reposition the whole thing anywhere we want in the photo. And we can see we're extending that darkness out. And you can have that fade be as to whatever degree you want it to be to blend in on your photo. So that's a really simple type of local adjustment. We did all the global adjustments. We just wanted to fine tune this one aspect. And there's no other way globally to kind of get that fade. And that's what masking, one of the things that masking can do. So now that we have this mask out, let's look at some of the interface options around masking that we can use as we move through other examples. So as soon as I applied that linear gradient, this new mask panel popped up. What's cool about this is we could see the mask right here, and we could see, kind of like if you're familiar with Photoshop, what a layer mask looks like. And we could see the gradient right inside that mask. We also see here the type of tool that was used to create that mask. Now, in some other examples, we'll see that we'll actually use multiple different tools to create a single mask. And that's where this gets really, really powerful. But even if you just have a single mask, this is still also really useful. This little eye icon right here, if I click and hold, it shows me the before. It shows me what it looks like without that particular mask being applied. So now I can see how that looks, and I could play around with it and go back and fine tune my adjustment if I need to. Now, in this case, I'm only going to use one mask. Where you have multiple masks, it can be really helpful to rename a mask. So instead of having this be mask 1, we could call this darken left side. And that way, if I had multiple masks here, it'd be a lot easier when looking at this panel to know which one does which thing. Now, if I wanted to further modify this mask, I could add to it or subtract from it using any of the masking tools that I wanted to. And we'll look at some examples of that. But for now, we're gonna move on from that. If I wanted to create an additional mask, I can just click this button here and again, choose from any of the different masking tools. If I wanted to see the overlay, I can turn it on here. I can press the O key, and that's just like from before. You press the O and that will show and hide the mask. If I've got a lot of red in this image, if I wanted to make sure I was seeing where the mask was and it wasn't on a strawberry or one of those begonias, I can press Shift and O and cycle through 4 different colors, from red to green to white to black, and then back to red. And that's really handy. That's an old functionality that has just come along for the ride. I can also take the overlay even further, and that's where this little color swatch comes in. If I click on this swatch, we get a whole little overlay pop-up, and I can choose from actual different overlay options. So there's the color overlay. I could change that color to something other than those 4 primary colors. And that could be really helpful if maybe you've got a lot of green or a lot of red or something, and you just need something to really stand out from your background or your objects in your scene. I can also change the opacity of that mask. If I needed to see a little bit where it was, but I wanted to be able to really see through to my photograph, I could affect the opacity. I'll leave it cranked up for now just so we could see the color a little bit better. I can always go back to my original colors if I wanted to. The other cool option of the overlay is we can change it from showing the area that's affected, which we were just talking about, to maybe it'd be helpful to see the unaffected area. So this is what's not at all being affected by this particular mask. And we could see the reverse fade until it becomes to the full effect of that particular adjustment. And there may be cases where that's useful. Then there's some overlay modes that may also be worth exploring. So color overlay is the standard one we're all familiar with. That's the default one. But what about having that color overlay on a black and white image? Maybe that would be useful in some cases. Or having the image appear black and white, but the color part shows the mask. And so now we're seeing that in that way. Or maybe have the image affected by the mask and the rest is in black or white, or just see the mask itself. All right. Whole different ways of working, and you can cycle through those a few different ways, including coming up to here and choosing the mode that you want and choosing, go back to a standard color. So masking just by the interface alone is already, if they did nothing else, is a nice superior improvement over what we had before. Having different layers for our mask and being able to rename them, that alone is pretty exciting for a lot of folks. Now, another thing I'll show you is if we had multiple masks here, we can disable the visibility of the effect of the mask with this little switch right here. and that turns off all visibility of all the masks that might be in play on a given image. Show you before and after of all your masks. If you're really wanting to learn keyboard shortcuts, we're not going to, I mean, I might mention a few in this session, but I don't want to spend a lot of time throwing alphabets at you. All you have to do is come up to this little question mark when you have a mask open, click on it, and this will show you all of the different shortcuts that you'd want to use as you become more advanced in your masking skills. There are even links to tutorials online that you can dive into on your own to get more out of the masking. So just file that away. This panel also does float. It's the only floating panel currently in Lightroom Classic that I'm aware of. You can dock it here if that's useful for maybe your screen real estate. Maybe you find that helpful. I like it out there on the side. You can put it wherever you want so it's not in your way. And that's a pretty cool aspect of masking. So when I'm done, say I'm done with this image, with this mask, I'm just going to press the escape key and get out of masking. And now I'm ready to move on to another example. All right, so that's just a quick look at it. Now let's look at a different type of mask and see another example of how we can use it. This one, I'm going to use a radial gradient. So all the basic adjustments I'm fine with. I just want to make this little fern here stand out from the rest, really be the star of the show. So I like using the radial gradient in that way because I can draw out this oval shape. It is very customizable. I can rotate it if I need it on an angle. I can stretch it out. I can reposition it around. And so we're seeing that overlay appear as just to help me see where I want this mask to go for this moment in time, knowing I can totally change it later on. And what I want to do with this in this example is actually not have the mask be on the main fern here, but actually be on the background. And I'm going to invert it. So there's a checkbox right here. I'm going to check that box. And now the area around my main subject here is now what's going to be affected by the mask or the settings I put in the mask. And the center part is totally unaffected by whatever settings I put in. And in this case, the gradient is the fade from this outer line, full effect, no effect, and that's the slow gradient. And we can control that with the feather slider. Now, notice that when I put my cursor over the photo, we see the handle and the pin. As I put my cursor over the sliders, that is automatically hidden. That should be on by default, and I find that to be the most useful way to work. If you click on that three-dot menu there, come down to show pins and tools, you can have the pins always visible so that when you move your cursor over, you can see where those pins and sliders lines are. So the feather is just controlling that inner line. And so we can have that be as smooth or as harsh as we want for a given situation. I'm going to put that auto back on. And you can always press the H key and that will hide the pins as well and then bring them back. All right, so now I've got my mask the way that I want it. And I'm just going to darken down the whole rest of the background. So that's going to make that little fern in the front just stand out all on its own. So simple use of a radial adjustment. All right, that's cool. What else can I do? Can I build on that? Well, it's always good practice. Let me just double click on this and name this the background. And if I want to kind of reverse this effect, I'm going to right click on this pin. And we can see that when you right click on a pin, and I'm on a Mac, so you can say control click if you don't have a right click mouse, but it is 2022. So I'm going to assume that you do. And if you don't, go to B&H and get yourself a mouse that has a right click button. You'll be happy. You can choose from a few different options here. We can delete the mask. That's a nuclear option. We're not going to do that. We can delete the individual mask. We don't want to do that just yet, but we can hide it or we can duplicate it. But now notice there's two different duplicate options here. What does that mean? So if I were to choose duplicate radial gradient, let me click into here for a sec. there's the radial gradient 1. That's what represents this circle right here. So if I right click back onto this and choose duplicate radial gradient 1, it adds a second radial gradient right over the top of the first one within this mask. And there could be a situations where you want it to have like a multiplier effect on a given setting that you're doing, and you could stack multiple masks this way and have them all be contained within a single mask. That's not my end goal here, but I just wanted to show you that as an option. What I want to do though is duplicate the entire mask, not this part, but the whole of the mask here. And I'm going to choose duplicate background. Why? Because I want to have different settings on this one than I have on this one. And that's why. So if I wanted to do kind of compound the effects of my settings, or if I wanted to add or subtract to this mask, I would work within this mask group and apply those things there. Now, in this case, what I want to do is have a different set of settings applied to this group. So I'm going to double click on this and choose and rename it to subject. And it has the same radial gradient in the same place as this mask group. But I want to do things differently. So what I'm going to do here is uncheck invert. And so now this gradient is affecting the same area, but the inverse of it. So kind of the inside of that in the same exact kind of footprint. But notice that it's also applied the same settings that I had on it before, and I don't want to do that. So if I double click this effect word right here, that will reset any sliders that have adjustments on it right here. So I'll double click effect, and that just zeroed that whole thing out. That's why the overlay came back. And so what I want to do here is kind of the opposite. I'm going to turn up the exposure and just brighten that up a little tiny bit. I'll bump up texture, maybe throw a little dehaze contrast and a little clarity bump. And maybe I'll warm this one up even a little bit. Actually, you know what I'll do? Let's make it green. We'll take that tint slider in a direction we don't normally take it and add some more green to make that more vibrant, and maybe take up the saturation. And so all I'm trying to do is hopefully subtly, maybe less subtle than so you can see it than I normally would, but just to try to bring some contrast out between this fern and the background. Now, if I turn off the switch right here, that's what it looks like without any masks. And then that's with my masks, and I can preview each individual mask and its effects that way. And if I want to change a setting, maybe I'll make this more blue just to cool it off in the background. And now it looks maybe more like a little beam of light, a little sunbeam was coming down and hitting this one fern and making it stand out from the rest. So masks give you that kind of flexibility to really build up some effects that are affecting opposite parts of the photo and creating that different contrast in color and texture, brightness, saturation, whatever those differences are, to make that element stand out a little bit more. All right, let's move on from that example. I'm going to hit the escape key twice and move on out of that. And let's look at another image. So again, basic edits have already been done. But now I want to try to affect the sky and do some things there, maybe to the foreground as well. And so let's look at a new AI-driven part of a tool added to the masking. So select subject and select sky are brand new and really powerful additions to the masking suite of tools. They are AI-based, meaning machine learning technologies were used to train this algorithm to recognize what a sky is or what a subject is. And we'll look at the subject one in another example here in a minute. But skies, we pretty much have a good idea of what a sky is. And to be honest, in my testing so far with masking, it does too. It does a really good job of finding a sky in a few different situations. So if I click on select sky, it will analyze the image and create a mask over just what it considers the sky. Now, for a single click, it did great. Now, could we use a linear adjustment almost as fast? Yeah, you could. There are some examples we'll look at where maybe the sky is a little more complicated than this, and having this AI-based version might do a slightly better job. Now notice that there are some red areas that extend down into this kind of smoggy, foggy, hazy area. And it's pretty light, right? So the darker red is going to always indicate a much stronger amount of whatever effect you dial in than anything that's kind of a grayed out, hazy, lower density type of mask. So the question may be, is it a problem? And we can see if we make edits and we don't like what it's doing to this area, we can use the subtract mode here and maybe use a brush and just brush out this area if we don't like the way it's going. But I think it's better to just see what the effects of your adjustment are going to be and then make your decision from there. So let's say I take down the highlights just to bring out some more detail in the sky. And maybe you take up dehaze because that's going to both deal with that atmospheric haze and add some blue into the sky as well. I don't want to go too far on it, but it's a subtle little change and I like it. All right, that's just sometimes a little nuance is all we need. So I'm going to just double click on this mask and call it sky. Now, what if we want to do kind of a similar set of adjustments that are specific to the foreground? How can we use these tools to make a selection on that? Well, we're going to create a new mask and choose select sky again, because it did such a great job there. And click on invert, and it just flipped it over. So everything that's not sky is now included in the mask. So now I can come in here and maybe do a little bit of dehaze here because there is a little atmospheric haze on that part of the foreground, and maybe take up the texture because I want to bring out, when you're, depending on the tool, the masking tool that you're in, you may not be able to zoom in just by clicking like you normally do. But if you hold the space bar down, see how it changes to the zoom tool. And now I can zoom in and just see as I'm going to increase some of these values here, sharpness and texture, clarity, just to make that really pop out a little bit more. And we'll call this one our foreground. And we can do a preview on that as well. So there's our kind of quick look at using the sky to deal with the sky, but also using it to deal with the foreground. So let's look at another example where maybe the sky function would work, but maybe it's not what we want to actually use. So in this example, we have a nice clean horizon line. And if I click on select sky, it will detect the sky. Now, the potential problem here is that it's a hard edge. There's no gradual transition from the top down to the horizon line. And maybe that's okay in some cases, but maybe you want to have a more graduated effect than just all the same settings that are on the top of the sky being applied along the horizon. So I'm going to undo that and choose the linear gradient option here and choose to drag down. Now, when I think about the linear gradient, and we did one before, I always think about an airplane going through the sky, and the area in front of the plane has not been affected by anything in this adjustment. But the area behind it, that's where that contrail might appear, does. So if I'm going to come from the top down, I want to affect the area that's on the top and less so on the bottom. So, right? So I'm going to hold down that shift key to constrain it to a perfect horizontal. And then I'm dragging out that line. And we can see that my horizon isn't perfectly straight. So I have two ways to correct that. I can rotate this until it lines up with my sky, or press the delete key. And there's a couple places where there's a sound effect in Lightroom. That's one of them. When you delete a local adjustment, you will get a sound. So I have a preset here. Let's see, auto level. Hey, there we go. Hey, now I have a level horizon. That's why I have a preset for that, because I don't know, maybe I'm a little crooked. I list to one side. So I'll come back into my linear gradient, hold down that shift key, and now I have a straight horizon. Great. So this is sometimes where you have to choose the tool that works best for the situation at hand and what you're trying to affect, what you're trying to create for a visual look. So now I have this graduated filter here. Now I can dial in maybe a little bit of darker exposure and a little bit of highlight recovery. And it is a kind of a sunsetty sky. So I could try, if I warm it up, I cool it down, which way goes better, maybe add a little magenta and maybe a little dehaze. And that way it's gonna slowly fade down to the horizon. Likewise, if I wanted to do something to the foreground, maybe I could use that select sky. So we'll call this sky. And I knew it did a great job of selecting just the sky. And I know that I have the option to invert it. And so now I have a mask that covers the entire foreground. And maybe I could do something if I wanted to maybe darken it down because it feels more like a sunset type of situation. And I want to add in another new adjustment. I'm going to add in a radial gradient. And I'm just going to draw out a little circle. Now its headlights are on. And let's warm that up and let's maybe brighten it up a little bit. I'll duplicate it. And I want to duplicate it inside of the mask, all right? Because I want to have all of these have the same settings. And that again. Put that down there. Oops, just did what there we go. Call this one headlights, so that makes it easier to see what I'm doing. We'll delete you and start over from here. So I've got this one, put over here, because these I want to all be, I don't want to duplicate the whole of the headlight mask. I want to just duplicate the radial gradient within it. So I can move it around to different lights. And there we go. And now we can collapse that down. So I have something on the headlights, the foreground, and the sky. And so there's the before and there's the after. And so this is how you start to build these things out and add little touches here and there that you just couldn't do any other way. All right, let's look at a select subject example. So what I find with select subject is, and I welcome you to test this out on your own images and see how you think it works. But I find it's definitely optimized on recognizing like a person for a subject or an animal. But if there's not a person or an animal, it does a pretty good job of detecting the thing that's most prominent or most in focus that you might consider a subject. So in this case, obviously we have a person there, pretty shallow depth of field. These objects are on the same plane as the person juggling. So they're all just as in focus as he is. So if I choose select subject, let's see how it does. Look at that. It actually grabbed the wrench floating in the air, as well as our main subject, a little bit of the background. And maybe that's a problem, maybe it's not. Depends again on the edit that you're going to make. And so if I wanted to maybe refine this a little more, I'd just say, well, what was my goal of making this mask, aside from just to show you how this works, is, well, I'd like to darken the entire background down. I think the subject is fine, so I'm going to use the invert option. And invert is great. A lot of times the best mask you can make is one that you can invert, right? So you start with where the tool's strength is, and then you just invert it. So now I have the most of the background is affected by this mask, except for a couple little spots here and this smiling guy right here, although he's mostly kind of blurry in the background. But if I wanted to add him into the mask, how can I do that? So let me come over to here. I'm going to rename this just to keep it clear. Background. I wanted to add him into the background. So we'll use the select subject. I'm going to add to that, and I'm going to add the brush. Now the brush is same brush that we've had for years now. And you basically control the size of the brush. There is a brush panel where you can control the size. This is a place where I really like using the keyboard shortcuts because my hands are already on the keyboard. Left bracket key will make it smaller. Right bracket key will make it larger, right? We also have a feather slider. And if you hold down the shift key, it will increase the feather. And if you press the right bracket key, it'll make that feather increase. If you hold down shift and do the left bracket key, it will reduce the size of that feather. That is the transition around the edge of the brush into the background. In some cases, you want to have a soft brush, soft transition. So you might have a lot of feather. In this case, though, I don't want any feather because I want to really just have it, the brush go right up against our primary subject here. And I'm just going to do a quick job and just brush over our background person, make sure his toes are mostly in there. And now if I want to zoom in, I'm going to press and hold the space bar, zoom in, make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'll just get the inside of this wrench. And this way, by inverting, starting with the subject and inverting it, is much faster to do that and just correct these little pieces than to try to brush over the entire background or something like that. All right, so now that I have my background pretty well included in this mask, what are the settings I want to choose? Well, I'm just going to darken it down a little bit, and that's just going to make him pop off that background even more than he did with the shallow depth of field. So select subject is great, even if you want to use it to select everything that's not that particular subject. Let's look at another example. So we have a brooding young man here who was kind enough to let me take his portrait. And what many things I love about this young man is his hair. And so let's see how select subject does with selecting the subject, which we will probably all agree is him, and including his hair. So let's choose select subject. And it does a pretty good job for a single click fix to get that type of hair in there. Now, is it perfect in here? No, but is it good enough? Probably. Depending on how far your adjustment is going to go, it might just be good enough. We can see it's lighter here, so there's a little bit of transparency of this mask, so it's not getting the full effect of whatever adjustments, but it will be affecting the sky that is showing through his hair in those places. But it really did catch a lot of the flyaway parts of his hair, enough for probably the type of subtle adjustment you might want to do in this kind of situation. So just like holding spacebar to zoom in, hold the spacebar and you can pan around, which is what I did there. And so if we want to zoom back out, hold the spacebar and let's zoom back out. So one thing I might want to do here is just, again, kind of like a reverse of the last example where I darken the background to make the subject pop out. This image is a little underexposed, a little dark. So I'm going to use the mask on our subject here and open up the shadows a little bit, open up exposure just a little bit as well. And again, just trying to create that contrast of him being able to pop off of that background a little more. Let's take it up just a little and let's warm him up a little bit too from the background. And are there more adjustments we could do? Yeah, but you get the idea that as soon as once you've created that mask, let's just rename this subject. You can come back and adjust these things to your heart's content. Let's take him up a little bit of texture and a little clarity. And of course, we always want to zoom in when you make these types of adjustments just to see, are we creating any weird halos around his head from those adjustments? Those adjustments are subtle enough that if we turn off the mask, we can see that adjustments were made, but not so much so that it's making a weird anomaly in the sky around his hair. And that's what we want to avoid when we're doing that kind of mask. So that's amazing that I could do that from a single type of a click. I can take that and let's make a new mask and choose select sky. And let's see how it does there. And so it got the sky, but we see how it brought a little bit of him in there too. We can see a little bit of the overlay. If I press Shift and O, let's see a little bit of the green cast that's appearing on his shirt there, a little bit around here. So how can we remove him, our subject, from this sky mask? That's pretty good. We can see it in the thumbnail there. It's pretty good. Maybe could we make it a little bit better? So what if we choose subtract and say subtract our subject from that and see if that takes it. So now it really took him out, but now we have that little bit of a transition area in the hair. Again, is it a problem? We don't know until we make our adjustment and see if it's creating a weird type of a halo that that we don't like. But again, hopefully at this stage, your adjustments are going to be more nuanced and not a big, heavy exposure shift or something like that. So let's take this sky and I want to just make it a little bluer. And let's take our highlights down, just darken it a little bit more. And if we were to go really far, let's say, see, that's what I mean about the halo. See, we can really see without even zooming in that we've created a problem. That's what we don't want to do. But a subtle little shift, I don't think will be a problem that we have to, it's a little bit. So part of the problem is that when I removed him from our sky using the select subject, we also removed that parts of the hair out. There's not a gentle really way to build that in. The best we can do, we'll just try it, see how it works, is use our brush, maybe with a feather, and see if we can add that parts of the hair back in a way that maybe doesn't reverse the problem. So I'm going to click on add this time and choose brush. And this time we'll take the feather up and we'll make the brush bigger. And what I want to do is just brush in around this hair. Now, obviously it's covering certain strands of hair when I'm doing this, but hopefully the hair is in the mask part, in the feather part, not in the full effect part. So now when I have that adjustment on the sky, it's not really showing through in his hair like it was before. So that actually worked out pretty well. And if we had more of an issue, I think it'd probably be pretty safe to just kind of brush around the outside edge of his hair, just keeping the feathered part of the brush over his hair. So it's really kind of just hopefully blending it with the other adjustment and the other mask a little bit more. It's like we gave him a little bit of a halo because he is a perfect angel, of course. All right, so now you can see how having one mask is great, having a second mask is awesome, but being able to modify an existing mask using a variety of different tools is where this becomes really powerful. We're going to cover a whole lot more of that in our second session when I come back next month. But I just want to give you a little bit of taste, and you can see that once you're starting to get the hang of this, all of that rest of that it gets easier and easier because now you're knowing how these tools work and what their limitations might be as you move through. All right, I've got about 15 minutes left. I wanted to show you a couple other things before we jump over to Q&A. All right, so here we have nice little downy woodpecker visiting my suet feeder last winter. And I want to make a selection on the subject, obviously being not only the bird, but also the suet cake here, maybe even the strands of twine. So if I click on select subject, let's see how well it does. So it did a pretty good job, right? It definitely got the bird in there, right down to the downy feathers that give it its name. Got most of the suet, even some of the strands, but it didn't include this part. And if I really wanted to include that part, this is where I would use the add function. And I'm going to use one of the tools that we haven't used yet, which is color range. So with color range, you can select a color or a range of colors in that similar hue within your image. So what I want to do is use color range and see if I can use it to select all the similar colors of this twine. And I'm going to click and drag out a little rectangle in here. That's just going to say, get all of this range of color within that selection. All right, so now I've got all of the subject included in this mask. Double click on that and call that subject. And what might I want to do? Well, let's take up the sharpness on that and really make that pop out, and a little bit of clarity, a little bit of texture, and make all of that good detail that's already there, but really kind of enhance it to help it stand out against that background. And it was kind of late in the day. Maybe we can warm it up a little bit too. So we're just working on that main part of the subject there. That's awesome. What if we want to do a background? So I'm going to make a new mask. I'm going to choose select subject again. We know what it's going to do. I'm going to invert it. And so now it does everything except for that same bit of twine. But we know how to solve that, right? We want to subtract this time. And we're going to use that color range and subtract it from there. All right, and so now the whole of the mask is just on everything except for our subject. And now I can maybe darken that down just a tad. Maybe I'll make it a little more blue to have that additional contrast of color as well as lumosity. And now we've got, using all of these tools, some finishing touches to make that subject really pop off that background. All right, let's see. All right, so here's an example of a winter lawn gnome of my son after snow blowing this winter. And I took a picture of him with iPhone that using the portrait effect. And so now we see that the depth range masking option is available for this particular image. So if I click on depth map or depth range here, we have a new mask, and currently nothing's being it should everything is included. So how can we refine this and visualize what's going on here? We can do it a couple ways. We can move the sliders here to control what is being masked based on the depth information that was included in that capture. All right. What if we want to see that mask, that depth map? We can see that the areas of lighter red here to darker red, a little bit of gradation here. He was pretty well far from the background, so it's a pretty clear cut depth map in terms of he was close, everything else was far away. But there's a little bit of difference between his arm that was further away from the camera than the arm that was closer to the camera. So if we wanted the information here to be just on the background, right? I'm just manipulating this part of the depth map mask here until he is fully revealed. And now the red is on the background. So that's what is being included in this particular mask. Create a new mask here with depth range. Just show you another way you can do it is once you apply it, instead of jumping over here to move these sliders around, you can take this eyedropper and just click on the part of the image, and it will select everything that is in that same distance from the camera based on that depth map. And so with a single kind of click that like that, I was able to select all of him. Would select subject do the same thing? Probably, right? So maybe it's okay to have a few different ways to make these different selections. Select subject did a better job of kind of the fuzzy edges around him. You never know on the situation that you have what tool is going to give you the best mask, and maybe you need another tool to do a subtraction or an addition to a mask, as we've seen in some of these examples. So it's nice to have that. It's kind of limited if you're only shooting with an iPhone though, right? So it's cool. Maybe there'll be other ways of getting a usable depth map for this masking purpose down the road. But at this point, this is kind of how it works. So I just wanted to show you that. It's not one that I use a lot because it's a edge case that I've got a photo that has that in it. One other one we haven't really looked at too much here is color, using a color range all by itself. So if we just click on color range without any other type of tool here. We want to select this red in the background. I just did a single click, and this is where Shift O changed the color. And now we can see the green shows where what is currently included in this mask. When you first apply a color range, you have this refine slider that you can tone it down to really just constrain the affected hues to the most similar to the area where you clicked, or you can turn it up to include as much as it will of that particular hue. So by turning it all the way up to 100, anything that was close to being red is now included in this mask. And so if we wanted to use that to our advantage and maybe change the color on that wall, we can use the hue slider here because every part of that red is included in it, and we can shift that color around pretty well right through the mesh of those cages. Now, all of this we can refine some more. So if we went, well, maybe we want to bring back, now that we did our general shift, can we reduce that enough to eliminate things that we don't want affected in it? Yeah, so color range is pretty cool. Let me delete this one. This is good. This 3-dot menu we'll cover more in the next lesson, but if we want to just go back to scratch here, I'm going to delete all the masks. I'll show you another part of color range is that if you click and hold the shift key, you can put up to 5 of these. If you put more, it says, hey, you can only do 5, chill out. And it will pull those away. All right. So you can add up to 5. Why would you do that? Well, you would click in other areas to try to bring in that particular shade of red. So it's telling me I need to delete one. So I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key and let's get rid of that one. There's that sound again. And I'm going to hold Shift and add one here. And see, by doing that, I included more of that red to make sure it was all instances of that shade of red were included in this mask. And then I showed you the other way of doing it, which is to click and drag out a rectangle like this. Sometimes that works, sometimes it goes a little too far, as it did here. So a few ways to fine tune your color selection based on your purpose for why you're creating that particular mask. Let's look at that in another example here. So in this image, if I wanted to affect the sparks coming off the spinning steel wool, I could use a color range. And I can draw out kind of that rectangle like this. And even down to the little fiery edges of the sparks, all of that was included. And of course, now I can refine that some more if I needed to. Then I might take it and maybe increase the saturation on it and maybe brighten it up a little bit more and add in some clarity and some texture and maybe even warm it up a little bit more. I like creating that kind of color contrast in things, subjects, and backgrounds when possible. And so now if I want to create a new mask, always get in the habit of naming it. We'll call this one Sparks. The new mask, and let's do the sky. See if Select Sky works here. All right, and so Select Sky did pretty good, but it looks like maybe included some of our sparks in it. So let's rename that to Sky. Let's see what are some ways we can maybe try to remove those sparks. Color probably would work because we saw it worked pretty well here. Let's see if we can do it with luminance range. So luminance works similarly to color in that you can use the eyedropper to select the luminance range that you want to affect. The problem with it in this example is that depending on the range you select, it selects it everywhere in the image. So we'd have to be, the only way this would work in this example is if the brightness values of these sparks were totally different than the values in the sky. And so if we adjust this to a darker range of luminance, let's see how we're covering more of the sky. If we bring this to the brightest parts, it's still adding in parts of the sky that is not going to work for this example. So I'm going to come over to the three-dot menu here and choose delete luminance range. That didn't work. Sometimes it doesn't work. So let's try subtract again. And let's try color range and select the color. And now we've pulled out the color sparks from the sky mask. That way I can come in here and maybe darken the sky down a little more and not darken those sparks, and add some more blue into the sky and build out that contrast a little bit more. So that's kind of a quick look at the whole interface of masking and an introduction to each of the tools and a couple of demonstrations. We got about 5 or so minutes left. Scott, are there any questions that I should try to answer before we run out of time, or do I have time to move on to another?
You've got time. If anybody has any questions for Rob, I don't know if we've put them to sleep or not. But if you've got any questions for Rob that he hasn't covered yet and you want to get answered, get them in now. Otherwise, Rob, I'll give you the time. Go ahead and
right.
Keep going.
Cool. All right, let's look at a different example. All right, so here's an example where we obviously have a sky. We've done some basic global adjustments, and due to the high contrast situation here, this is just a single exposure. We haven't really opened up the shadows here maybe as much as we want, and we maybe have over brightened the sky. So how can we use masking to help in this kind of situation? Well, if we want to affect the sky, let's start with choosing select sky. It's always a good way to go. And got the sky, but we can see here it maybe had some trouble with this part of the trees and along the horizon here. Didn't do a full job grabbing all that in. Could we add it in? Maybe we could. And it also brought in some of the edges of this log that's sticking out over here. So it didn't do, didn't do perfect here. So let's see if we can come at it from a different angle. So I'm going to delete that mask. And I'm going to do a linear gradient because that's the old standby for the sky anyway. And I like the idea of having a graduated fall off towards the bottom here where the sun is shining. We maybe don't want to have that in a uniform effect. All right, so now we're covering the area we want to cover. That's fine. But we're also included this bit of log that's sticking up into our area of the sky. And we're also including the sun a little bit there too. So how can we take this part out of, at least this part out of the sky? So let's call this sky so we know what we're talking about. And I want to subtract from that, and let's try luminance range here. What I want to take out is the darker parts of the luminance range. So as soon as I clicked with the eyedropper, we see where that affected the area. This is the darker tonal range, right in this section here. And there's a slight fade off here. So if we wanted to increase that fade off, it will now start going into the sky in ways that we don't want. So I'm going to bring that back. I'm going to shift O this into red. I think that might show a little bit better here. We could also increase if we wanted to bring it into brighter parts of the sky, but that's going to affect our sky. So the first click there really did a nice job of removing the log from the sky without affecting the parts of the sky that we wanted to adjust. And the sun is so bright, it's not included in that part either. So now we have our sky selected to the parts we want and excluded the branch. Now we can darken that down. We can add in some more blue and add in some dehaze and make that sky a whole lot more attractive. Now, if we wanted to affect the foreground here to maybe brighten this up, let's create a new mask and use luminance range on that and just click right into this darkest part. And now we have a mask that really just affects the darkest tones in this image. And because the rest is the bright sky, it's not included at all. We see a little bit as leaking into here. So we can change that with this guy. So if we bring this all the way up, that's going to increase that fade into brighter regions. So we want to take that in the opposite direction until all that's included is the darkest parts of this image, because that's really all we're concerned about, is how can we open things up in the darkest values here, come down to our shadow slider. And now we can start to open that up, maybe add some warmth into it so it doesn't look so harsh. And so there's our before, and then there's our after, just with a couple of masks. And obviously I would continue to fine tune that to get it looking a little bit better, but we have the basics of the mask that we'd use. So that's the hard part is done. Now it just comes down to moving some sliders around and finding our best set of settings. So I'll end it on that note, but know that in the next session, we're going to look at more advanced uses of the masks, as well as some tips on creating presets and using those as different starting points. And probably the most confusing part of masking, intersect. We'll look at how to use intersect to create really complex masks as well. So that's all I have for us this time. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those before we sign off. But if not, I thank you for your time and attention, and see you next month.
That's it. Thanks so much, Rob. We appreciate it. That's a ton of great information. And you know, I'm not the most advanced Lightroom user or really any editing software user. So to see how advanced it's become and how many features they've added and how far, you know, they've come from the days where it really was a tool that had very limited use, to see now how exponentially grown it's become is really, it's breathtaking. It's great. And, you know, it's great to see. I definitely want to give a huge thanks to our sponsors over at Adobe for sponsoring this event. And if you like this stuff and you're into it and you want to get better at it, you know, shameless plug for Rob. He didn't ask me. I'm not getting paid or endorsed for this, but you know, get a book, pick a book up. Even if you don't buy the book, I'm sure you can go to the library and find it. You know, I'm sure there's a ton of great information that you could pick up from it. So
Thanks, Scott.
definitely make sure to support everybody who comes and provides all this wonderful education for everybody. So thanks, Rob.
And in the replays on the event space, there's at least 4 other sessions I've done on different aspects of Lightroom and Photoshop too. So check those out. It's already there, right at your disposal.
And it's free. That's the best.
Free.
It's free. We're not charging you for it. We're giving this stuff away. We're going out of business. Just God forbid. That would be terrible for everybody. But we'll see you back here shortly. Thanks for joining us again. This has been another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We'll catch you next time.